All right, so I think everyone should be able to see this. So of course, this is a very timely topic. News came out yesterday, coming out today about election attacks. And it's pretty clear that this is going to shape up to be fairly significant. I was updating my slides maybe 10 minutes ago since news just keeps coming out. So what I want to talk about is kind of how I view election security, what the biggest risks are, and ultimately why what really matters is what the people think and how we can best secure the people, best secure our elections, because our elections are secure and they will be secure. The adversaries are targeting us to make us think that won't, but we can fight that by being confident in the election systems. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So if we take a step back, when most people think of election security, what they typically think of is voting machines. And the media has really traditionally covered election security as such, showing headlines about how easily voting machines can be hacked. And this is supposedly a big threat to election security. But in reality, voting machines are really just a small part of the puzzle. And election security isn't about voting machines. It's about protecting the election as the whole. And there's so much more to the election than voting machines. I view them as, I'd say, the least significant component of the process. So kind of thinking about what the actual threats are. On the top, we have voting machines, which are, of course, get a lot of attention, but aren't necessarily the highest risk. And that is because most of the time they're not connected to the internet. You would need to do a physical attack against them. And increasingly, many of them have a paper trail. So the latest stat is that over 90% of ballots cast in 2020 will have a paper backup. So that allows election officials to perform audits on them to verify that the tabulated result actually matches what people voted. So because of that, voting machines aren't necessarily the biggest target for elections. What is more concerning is both auxiliary election infrastructure. So this is systems like voter registration websites, election night reporting systems that are connected to the internet that people interact with. And these don't necessarily interact with the vote. So targeting them wouldn't affect election results, but it could affect them in other ways. For instance, if a voter registration database is hacked and components of it are changed, that could lead to people showing up on election day not being able to vote because the poll book says that their address is something that's different from what their address actually is. Likewise, an election night reporting system, if that was compromised, could be used to spread false information about the election, cause confusion, even if the underlying votes are still secure. So we have campaign infrastructure as well, which I'll get into more. We saw that targeted in 2016 pretty significantly with targeting of the DNC. And that led to a lot of public attention about election interference. And then building onto that, lastly, we have the people. So the voters who are participating in the election, who ultimately judge if the election is valid or not. These are perhaps the biggest attack surface for adversaries, just because in order to compromise an election, you don't need to change the votes. You just need to change people's thoughts and change their view of the election being valid. If ultimately the people don't trust the results of the election, then the election isn't valid. So this is important to keep in mind when adversaries are trying to interfere in the election. Their goal isn't the voting itself. Their goal is the voters. They want to change people's minds so that people don't believe the outcome, so that they have less trust in the democracy and the democratic processes. Not that they necessarily want to actually change the votes, because that's difficult, but they can have the same effect by just changing what people think. So let's take a look first at 2016. I'll get into in a little some of the recent news, of course, that's happened in 2020. But since that's still coming out, 2016 is helpful to have kind of a wider picture of what we know happened. In 2016, and this is confirmed in reports like the Mueller report, as well as a bipartisan Senate report talking about the election interference that occurred. The Russians targeted people through these wide-scale disinformation campaigns, candidates by hacking the DNC and associated mail servers, and lastly, election adjacent systems themselves by some hacking of voter registration databases. So the first part, the people, We saw these disinformation campaigns, most famously with the Russian Internet Research Agency, that targeted American voters with divisive content and trying to essentially cause divides between people on both political sides. We see on the left a slide that's about Hillary Clinton trying to damage her. And then on the right, we have one that's targeting more left-leaning voters. So the goal of this was to sow discord, increase divides between Americans. And one thing to note here is that even though both of these are advertisements, the vast majority of content promoted by the Internet Research Agency in their disinformation campaign was not boosted, was not paid for, but rather it was Americans naturally sharing this content. So a lot of times people will talk about regulating political advertising as a way of fighting disinformation, but the vast majority of the disinformation that's being spread is just naturally, it's Americans seeing it, believing it, and sharing it. So if we want to mitigate that, we have to think about more than just the advertisements in order to reduce susceptibility to disinformation. So we have the people, then we have the candidates. So this is a now infamous email that was sent to John Podesta, who was the chair of the DNC. And this was a phishing email, one of the ones that we're taught never to click. But John Podesta clicked it, he entered his password in. I think the story is that he sent it to his IT person, asking if it was a valid email. The IT person replied back saying that was a legitimate email. Now, apparently the IT person mistyped, meant to say illegitimate email, but sent legitimate. So John Podesta clicked it, entered his password, and his email account was compromised. And what this led to was a massive hack and leak operation where the Russians posted through a variety of accounts tied to WikiLeaks, leaked documents from the Clinton campaign alleging some form of misconduct. And the effect that this had was wide scale because news outlets reported it almost immediately. And the reason it was so effective was that most of the content was true. So we might think of disinformation as spreading fake news, false content, but really it's most effective when it's either all true information or say mostly true information with some lies sprinkled in, because then people believe it and for instance, the news outlets will report on it. So that's the extent of targeting campaigns and the wide-reaching effects that can have with voter confidence, with hack and leak campaigns. And of course, lots of information has come out about this over the past few years. Lastly, with regards to the election systems, we know that Russian actors, based on the bipartisan Senate report, targeted all 50 states with hacking attempts, many of which were SQL injection, which is perhaps one of the most common web vulnerabilities out there. We know that through public reporting, both Illinois and Arizona had their voter registration systems breached. As talked about in the Mueller report, Russian actors exfiltrated data from the Illinois server on Illinois voters. Conveniently, I'm a voter, so could very well have been my data, which is great to think about. But there's no evidence that they actually modified any data, which is curious. It's unclear perhaps what their motivations were. Maybe it was just to spread confusion. We see that Russian actors are in our election servers, and that leads to wide-scale confusion, less trust in the election processes. So of course, while this is only targeting these internet-facing systems that don't actually touch the votes themselves, the average person isn't going to realize that and is going to see this as potentially decreasing the legitimacy of the vote. So now we come to 2020. And of course, things are ramping up where less than 2 weeks until election day. Early voting has already been going on for weeks. People have been mailing in their ballots. Millions have already voted, and the election is in full swing. So what are we to make of, for instance, the recent revelations that state-sponsored hackers, both Iran and Russia, have been targeting our election systems? First, to talk a bit about kind of what came out yesterday and today. and I'm sure more will come. But first, just to take a step back, acknowledging the fact that elections do look a little different this year. We've heard a lot about, of course, all sorts of disinformation being spread about mail-in ballots, and different statements being made about that. But what's important to keep in mind is that ultimately the election process will be kept secure. We do have audible votes. Election officials conduct audits on those votes in order to see if wrongdoing has occurred. We've heard a lot, for instance, about possible delays of election results. And of course, that is not to be concerned about because it only means that we have more time to verify that the results are valid. But of course, that won't stop, for instance, adversaries from spreading disinformation while we don't know who winner is, perhaps suggesting that the election is not valid. So what is the impact of election security as a result of these changes? Like I said earlier, really the biggest risk to election security is not actually someone going in and changing votes. That's hard to do. It's people losing faith in the election results. And the cause of this can be foreign or domestic. We've certainly seen foreign influence in the last few days, but there's been domestic influence going on for the past few months. And part of the work, for instance, I've been doing with the Stanford Internet Observatory and the Election Integrity Partnership, which is a group of 4 research entities we stood up. We are seeing that the vast majority of election misinformation, election disinformation is domestic. So as people spreading information that they believe to be true, that they think is important to be shared, but the result of this is lowered confidence in election processes and decreased trust in the eventual outcome. So certainly we've seen some foreign efforts, but I think it's important not to let that overshadow really just the fact that Americans alone are pretty good at getting worked up about these different risks at delegitimizing their own election. Foreign adversaries can aid that, but I think the vast majority of this kind of disinformation out there is domestic. So with regards to some of the domestic stuff we've seen, if we look at some of the primaries, for instance, we see just how easily certain election mishaps can be spread to suggest, for instance, that elections are rigged or that they're invalid, both with the Iowa caucus, the flaws of an app, where while there's no sign that there was any wrongdoing, this led to people, including prominent political figures, accusing the election of being invalid, even though all signs point to it just being a standard bug. We've seen the same thing in states like Georgia, where failures in e-poll books led to long wait times and suggestions of interference. But once again, this seems to just be a routine technical failure. So I would take claims of, say, hacks or interference with a very heavy grain of salt, because a lot of the time is just a legitimate problem that occurred. It doesn't mean that anything has been compromised and things will get back to normal soon enough. But of course, this is not to be forgotten that legitimate interference can occur. So yesterday came out, perhaps the first sign of major interference in our elections. We saw both emails sent from now known as Iranian actors, pretending to be from the far-right group, the Proud Boys, threatening voters to vote for Trump or else. So the government has concluded that this is Iranian actors pretending to be the Proud Boys in order to threaten voters. The intelligence agencies also revealed that both Russia and Iran have obtained voter data. Now it's not clear exactly what they've obtained. There have been some additional reports today saying that both Russian and Iranian actors have been targeting, in some cases, compromising government systems. We don't really know what kind of data has been compromised. For instance, with the Iranian emails, a lot of that is just public voter data. Something that is not too widely known is that the vast majority of voter data is public. It's available for purchase by, for instance, political groups, public citizens, or researchers, and can be aggregated and can be sold beyond that. So it's perhaps not surprising that this kind of data has been obtained. Of course, this doesn't exclude the possibility that election system, for instance, a voter registration system, was actually breached and more sensitive data was taken. But this time, that's not really known. But again, with all of this, the risk isn't that the votes are going to be changed. The risk is that public confidence in the election is going to be undermined. So the goal of these Russian, these Iranian actors isn't to actually change our election. They don't want to change the votes because that would be very difficult. They want to change people's opinion of the election so that people don't believe the results. So I think when we think about what can we do to stand up to this, really the most important thing is just communicate to people that the election is still secure, that they haven't actually compromised the election itself, and that we can still be confident in the result. So that's really important to get across, because you'll hear people say this a lot, that the most effective way to fight against this disinformation is to go out and vote, is to participate in the election process. Because if everybody does that, then the adversaries are unsuccessful because the people's voices are ultimately being heard. So really 2020, thinking about it from an election security standpoint, it's all about communication. With the public, like I was saying, needs to understand a couple of things about how elections work. The first is that the number one priority of election officials is to maintain election integrity. Every single election official I've talked to at either the state or local level has the integrity of the election as their priority. That's what they want to maintain, and that's what their job is to do. Part of that, we know that both in-person and mail-in voting are verifiable and secure. So voting by any of those means that your vote will be counted and that you will participate in the election process. We've also seen some messaging about the election results. So yes, election results may take a little longer, and that's okay. That's just by nature, given a shift to more mail-in voting. By state laws, some election results will take longer to count because, for instance, many states can't start processing mail ballots until either right before or on election day. So just by nature, it could take some more time for election results to come in. But ultimately, like I said, the result of the election we can still trust, even if it takes a little longer. That just means we've had more time to verify that the results are actually accurate and that they can be trusted. And lastly, and this is perhaps a conclusion of the last few days, we know foreign actors are trying to divide us, but the vote remains secure. And the way we fight these foreign actors is by really just trusting our election system, trusting the processes that are in place, the election officials that work very hard to maintain the integrity of their votes. None of this indicates that people's votes can be compromised. All the evidence points to that people's votes are still secure and that we can trust the election results. So what we have to do to fight that is just to go out and vote, encourage others to do so and have their voice heard. I'll talk a little bit about what we can do to improve security beyond just 2020, because of course, election security won't go away just after this election. We need to be thinking about this continually, not just during the election seasons, as has traditionally happened, but election security is going to be an ongoing problem and has to always be being addressed. So one measure is to increase funding and access to talent for state and local governments, because these election officials are often under-resourced. They don't have enough money or staff to do the important work they need to secure their election systems. We need to increase security testing of election systems with public assessments in order to ensure that these systems are actually secure. And lastly, we need to work on the public messaging to ensure that people know how to fight these disinformation campaigns, that they know that the election is still secure, even if adversaries are trying to meddle in our elections. Talk briefly about just some of the advancements that have occurred here. So one really important area that election officials have been working on that I've contributed to is with the advent of vulnerability disclosure policies for election systems. So this is something that I actually helped Stanford with. My freshman year was starting a bug bounty program to pay students and faculty for reporting vulnerabilities in Stanford systems. Unfortunately, now election officials and voting companies are starting to entertain similar ideas with the launch of vulnerability disclosure policies. So while these don't yet pay people for reporting vulnerabilities, they accomplish many of the same goals by allowing anyone in the public to report vulnerabilities to them and ensuring legal protection for doing so, which is an important component. So we've already seen, for instance, that on the top, Ohio has launched a vulnerability disclosure policy for their election system. So anyone can report a vulnerability to them. Likewise, Iowa was the second state to do so. And then we've also seen voting vendors doing the same. ES&S, which is the largest voting vendor in the country, has done so, as well as Hart and Dominion, which are the second and third largest voting vendors. And several others have said they plan to do so as well. So we're seeing really significant process here in order to engage the entire security community, the public, in securing these election systems. And lastly, just to talk a bit about the work we're doing at the Election Integrity Partnership. Like I mentioned, this is a group of 4 research entities to fight disinformation. So I encourage you to visit our website, eipartnership.net, to learn a bit more about the work that we've been doing. We publish very frequent write-ups on the kinds of disinformation we see. You can read about that, see how the vast majority of the stuff we found is domestic, is Americans misleading themselves, spreading false information that leads to the election results or election processes being delegitimized. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And ultimately, the key question here is, can we make humans more resilient to these nation state attacks? Yes, we have to secure the election process, but what ultimately matters is that people believe the election results, and that has to come from people being resilient to these disinformation campaigns that we know adversaries are trying to do. So we need to work to improve this in order to ensure that people ultimately maintain faith in the election processes. Lastly, what to keep in mind for the next few weeks. So CISA, which is also an agency I'm doing work with, has what they call the 3 Ps of the election. And this is something that they encourage every voter to follow. Number 1 is being prepared. So having a plan for how you're going to vote, whether that's by mail, whether that's early in person, whether that's in person on election day, have a plan and follow through with that. Second is participate. This is probably the most important part, is to make your voice heard. So go and vote in whatever way works best for you. Encourage others to do so. If you're healthy and willing to do so, serve as a poll worker is a great way to ensure that your fellow citizens can also participate in the election process. And really just ensure that ultimately everyone's voice is heard. And lastly, be patient. We know that may take a little longer for election results to come out, but that doesn't mean that we can't trust the election results. So no matter what happens, we know that the election results will be sound when they come out. It might take longer than we're used to, but we can trust the election systems that election officials have worked so hard to protect. So ultimately, it will be seen. Who knows what else could come out in the next few weeks, given the kinds of disinformation we've seen. But with any of this, it's important not to lose faith in the election processes and keep in mind that ultimately we will have a safe and secure election this fall. So with that, thank you everyone for tuning in. Happy to stick around a little more and answer questions in the chat. I'm not sure if there's time now to answer questions, but thank you to everyone for showing up.